All right, I think we are good to kick off. Welcome everyone to the Platform 9 Ask Us Anything session on security. Today's session is an open format, so we are looking forward to questions and interaction from everyone that's put aside some time to join this session. If you'd like to chat with us or ask questions, feel free to use the Zoom chat. Jump into our Slack channel and go into the AMA section there. Or if you would like to unmute yourselves and engage in some open dialogue, use the Zoom raise hand session capability. If you do that, we just ask that we limit it to one question because we want to make sure we have time to cover what everyone that's dialed in would like to cover. If there's no other questions, we're always open to continue chatting. And with that, I'm going to introduce our host of the day. My name is Chris Jones. I'm a group product manager here at Platform 9. I look after our Kubernetes platform. That includes our free tier that's available for everyone to use, as well as our growth and enterprise paid platforms. On the phone with me is my co-host for this week's session, Jorn from NewVector, and I'll let him jump in and introduce himself.
Hey everybody, glad to be here. My name's Jordan. Again, I'm from NewVector. We do some pretty unique platform security inside of Kubernetes. Chris and I bumped into each other on the internet, of course, at a NADOG, North American DevOps group Slack channel. And we started talking about both of our products because we're both very interested in Kubernetes platforms. I opened up by telling Chris, tell me more about Platform 9 because other people have been whispering in my ear how wonderful Platform 9 is. I've been in the IT industry with 30 some years. I've been with NewVector about a year and a half. And I've got old stories and new stories to tell, especially about security and compliance and even just operations inside of Kubernetes. It's an interesting journey that companies are on. And I'm glad we have this AMA kind of platform session. To the audience, I think that we have a gift for you, Chris and I do, in the fact that we have we don't have a bunch of slideware for you to look at and listen to us talk. This is an Ask Me Anything session. So I've probably used up all of my jibber jabbering talk. How was that, Chris?
That was good. That was some great background. We also have David Drift on the line from Platform 9 as well. David runs our developer relations here at Platform 9, and I'm sure if we ask big enough questions, he might also chime in with some words of wisdom. So with that, I'm going to jump in and I guess just kick things off with the one slide that I have. Mm-hmm. Topics, I think there's Kubernetes security is a really broad space. It goes from CIS benchmarks, node hardening, network layer security, what's coming in and out of your applications and your clusters, how your applications, pods, deployments configured to run, Kubernetes vulnerabilities themselves and CVEs that come out. And I think it's introduced a whole new world of security compliance and complexity. And that's only getting sort of in that infrastructure layer. Once we get into role-based access control, network security policies and stuff like that, it gets even more complicated. And I think a lot of people might be sort of like, well, where do I start? So hopefully we can talk about some great topics if there's questions. If not, I think I'm just actually going to go straight to a tool that I think is a great first step in this journey. I'm going to change to Firefox, and hopefully my screen is sharing correctly. On the screen here is actually a tool that I installed called Cubescan that's running within a Kubernetes cluster that's running on Platform 9. And this is a scanning tool for network vulnerabilities. It's open source, it's out there. This was super easy to install. Just followed the instructions on GitHub, and I think this is a great first step if you're new to Kubernetes and you're wondering, is my cluster even safe? Maybe some of the containers I deployed, what are they looking like? Or maybe what are the threats? How do I start learning about these? There's some great open source tools out there. I can share a link actually in the chat from a blog that's on Geekbench that goes through a bunch. I personally love anything that's got a web UI, and Cubescan's got quite a nice one put together. 2 commands to install it, which was just a kubectl apply. For those of the world that are new to Kubernetes, which I know a lot of us still are, it uses a kubectl port forward command and forwarding the Cubescan service and the UI from the cluster to locally here on my machine, which is why it's running on localhost 8080. So it's pretty quick to get up and running. I think this is a great way to get going. The cluster I've connected to has Rook. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm assuming that to do this, you needed some pretty decent access to the cluster though, right? Like basically admin.
This is correct.
Yeah, so just it's one of those things that you don't even realize it, right? You just got your kube config and go, and turns out I need a good amount of access.
Yes, yeah. Immediately there's this barrier to entry around role-based access control. And depending what you've used to build your cluster, it's going to impact that. That if you're on an EKS, you might need to be in the system masters group for that cluster and have either the user within the AWS Identity and Access Management group added, or that user in a group and that group added to systems masters to have the ability to install something that runs at a low level and can access all of the pods and deployments.
Chris Siddharth has a good question in the chat asking if Cubescan sends any notification to like a SIM or to Slack. Can it shout out that something's broken to an external connector?
That's a great question. This is an element that I started looking at from a product perspective as well. Mm-hmm. Cubescan, as it stands from an open source perspective, does not. Some of the other tools that you can install, I will change quickly to the blog. If people are interested to find one of these tools and get them going in their environment, Geekflare, 8 Kubernetes scanning tools to find vulnerability and misconfigurations. I'm going to copy that and put it in the chat to everyone, panelists and attendees, so people can bookmark that to get going. So there's a number of tools here. Cubescan doesn't send out notifications. A bunch of the other ones are command line outputs, so they generate files that you can access and review over time. When I started looking at this from a product perspective, that was sort of the immediate thing that I thought, well, if I'm going to bring this into Platform 9 to start enhancing our security posture and alleviating that is something that you would need to do as an end user, having a notification capability of either email, Slack, or a webhook that's configurable, and then you can configure this to run on a certain time frame would be a great start. So it's good to see that others out there are thinking the same thing.
Yeah, I get that question a lot from folks just right at the entry. What are just best practices for setting up, and what are best practices at initial assessment right at the front end? This looks like a pretty handy tool, Chris.
Yeah. There's a question that's come in. Have I tried to run this against Platform 9? We have found some of the open source tools have mismatch of paths, as with some tooling. Yeah, that's a really good call out there. For everyone that's on the call, there's some very popular tooling like CIS Benchmark and others that are open source. These tools that sort of run on the node and cluster level that scan the entire system for configuration are are a great way to start improving the security of your clusters. The catch that's been mentioned here is they're kind of assuming a default 100% upstream deployment of Kubernetes. And there's really many different ways to create and deploy clusters. Platform 9 distributes upstream Kubernetes. We don't have a distribution per se, but we do run things slightly differently, like etcds in a container. And where we put some configurations and files are in different spots than what CIS benchmark would expect. So if you are going to get on one of those tools, it's probably great to work with the vendor or the distribution to make sure that it's tuned correctly for that particular implementation, so that you're not getting a whole bunch of false positives. I think it's also important with any security tool to then go through and look at anything that's come through as a red flag or a positive and manually validate that as well. So this Cubescan is actually running on a Platform 9 cluster. For full transparency, it's on this one, just 2 nodes. It's running Kubernetes 120. It's on 2 virtual machines running on our OpenStack cloud on Ubuntu 18 hosts. I haven't put any sort of significant effort into hardening this cluster in any way. And you can sort of see immediately that Rook Ceph is calling out as something that's kind of high risk. And it's calling out things like the workload allows privilege escalation. If you're new to the world of containers and Kubernetes, clicking show more will give you a little bit more information about what that vulnerability means. You want to sort of love to get your input here on working NuVector and being in the security space, and I guess your customers and users that you talk to, how people, I guess, go about even starting the process. If they run a scan like this, what's next?
How much do I soapbox? But and I've had some interesting observations over the last couple of years. And I'll give you a little, I'm going to set the stage a little bit from a backstory. Remember, a lot of the people that I talk to, think of the people that come in and go, oh my God, we need, air quotes, security or compliance in our Kubernetes cluster. They're coming to us at different stages of their Kubernetes deployment. And I'm also getting lots of different people. More often than not, and this may sound scary, is there's already production workloads running in Kubernetes somewhere. And then an organization will go, oh my, something security. And they'll wind up getting on calls with us a lot of times. But the people that I'm talking to are, not all the time, a lot of times I'm talking to developers, but the people leading the charge are either from an operations standpoint or from straight up from a SecOps standpoint. And those are folks with a lot of seasoned experience in IT. And some of them know Kubernetes pretty well. And some of them maybe don't. And what happens is, I think that they don't realize that it's not just a bunch of little VMs. I have to tell people, you need to, when I'm talking to ops people and security people, look at your Kubernetes clusters, each and every one of them, the same way you look at each and every data center. Because from to an ops person, when I'm talking to them, a Kubernetes cluster really is sort of its own data center in a data center. More people than not go, oh my, I guess we didn't realize that. And the reason I'm telling that story is I see people when we start deploying to Kubernetes, and I love Kubernetes, its infrastructure as code, it enables all the things that really are in a DevOps organization. But I see a problem where what happens is, even from an operational standpoint in the organization, there's sort of like, well, who's in charge of the traditional ops? When you went out and requested a VM, you knew where things were, you knew who was in charge of it, there was a CMDB for it. In Kubernetes, a lot of times I was seeing, well, they said, well, who's in charge of these containers? Who's in charge of knowing what this communication is? Who owns really security? And a lot of times, everybody I talk to thinks it's somebody else. So when we try to approach, we have to go look and say, look, it really is sort of a data center and a data center. How do you want to approach those security postures, and what does security mean to you? Is it just scanning for vulnerabilities? I would like to think that it's not just that, and defense in depth needs to be approached at a cluster level rather than hoping that firewalls catch things, outside the perimeter of the cluster. So while there's lots of solutions out there in the world, my advice to people is to step back and zoom out and go, hey, it is its own infra inside of there, and expecting developers to also saddle the burden of things that in the past operations took care of, or SREs are handling, or security is asking a lot of your developers. If I'm a dev, I need my application running, it needs to work, and I need to go apply updates to it. Don't make me run the data center. And I see organizationally a lot of times that sort of running of the data center, so to speak, gets left to the developers. I don't know if I answered your question or made it even broader, but I wanted to bring up that operational point.
It is. I mean, I think a lot of people could start with Kubernetes. They've got applications that might already be containerized, start deploying them. And you're right, the way that Rook is operating here, it requires privileged access. Calico networking is the same spot.
Yeah.
And I think pod security policies, started off as an attempt to control what was running in a cluster.
Right.
They've just been recently deprecated.
Yeah, well, and because the CNCF and the working group in Kubernetes said, wait a minute, this is a lot for us to take on here. It was hard to run PSPs. The company that I work for, our product in NeuVector, throwing out a little commercial, we've been doing those kinds of controls for PSPs all along in our product, with part of admission control. So that's productized, it's automated inside of NeuVector, and it's pretty easy to do. I dropped a link to a little blog post we did in the chat, so I don't want to bore people with an ad for it, but if you want to go look at that blog post and see how those are working, the panic about where did my PSPs go, we have you.
If you want, I can stop sharing. We can take a look.
Oh, unless somebody really needs to see it again, I want to make sure that people are getting their questions answered.
If you don't mind, I'm going to throw 2 cents in here, because for me personally, when it comes to Kubernetes and starting up a cluster, my point of view usually starts with all the things that you guys have just said, right? With PSPs and volumes, pod security, cluster roles, cluster role bindings, roles, all that stuff. But what I have to remind myself is underneath all this is an operating system, right? CentOS, Ubuntu, something, Linux, usually. Well, it could be Windows too, but most of the time it's Linux. And that operating system gets patched, just like any other operating system in the world. There's nothing different. It's just this operating system is running containerization, and that's about it. Most likely it's probably, maybe it's based on some golden image that an organization has and has been certified or whatever, but it's still an operating system nonetheless, and it has to be patched. And then you run different daemons, processes within that to make it a, Kubernetes master or Kubernetes workload or node or whatever. But, all of these primitives of computing still exist, even though Kubernetes is, so sexy and has so many, cool moving parts within it. It still uses the fundamentals. And I'm just throwing that out there because that's I have to remind myself of that a lot.
Yeah, and it is Linux, sort of up underneath, and it's wonderful from an assertion standpoint, but Kubernetes is hard. It's complicated. If it weren't, everybody at Platform 9 would be out of a job, right? It's hard to do, and it's another layer of management that you have to engage in your organization. And sometimes taking that responsibility model as an end user and moving it up so you can concentrate on things that are differentiator at your company and the thing that makes your company money is really the move to make.
And that, that's probably, Jordan, I'd be interested in hearing your opinion about this, but for me, for the few customers that I've seen that do well with Kubernetes, most of them I've noticed that one of the commonalities is they know where to draw the lines between different roles in the company, right? Where traditional maybe IT ops is in here at a possibly hyper-converged layer, where our platform operators started in, where our developers started in. They've took the time to figure that out, because everybody's figuring that out with Kubernetes, and they've drawn the lines. And so everybody shares a contract. I'm going to do this and create this. That's going to create an API for you then to consume. And then you can do your job. And the ones that are doing this well, I think they all kind of share that contract relationship between the different roles.
I absolutely agree with you. And where I see companies get hurt the most are organizations that had those lines drawn, and their policies and practices are from 1996. Like I was saying earlier, things have sort of changed. Or what really happens is they've got those policies and practices, and that somebody went through. It's that old shadow IT conversation. Like, we've won shadow IT, everything's been taken care of, and they're following the rules. Everything's in a CMDB. They're tracking. They've got all the security wrapped around all of their infrastructure. But when you come to them, I've come to many organizations. This is terrifying but true, where it's something along the lines of, you can ask maybe the security department, the operations department, well, show me your security, like maybe it's an audit, show me your security controls against the stuff that's production. And they'll say, oh, well, this development group over here, they've got these 6 or 8 VMs running, and we've got all of the controls wrapped around it. And you say, well, what's running on those 6 VMs? And they go, well, just this thing called Kubernetes. And you go, have you peeled the hood back on that? Like, well, no, the VMs are, compliant. Do you know there are 867 containers running on those 6 VMs? And the operations people are like, no, we didn't know that. And then you ask, well, you didn't know to shift the line. And that's that black hole that I was talking about. The developers in there are going, I'm not an ops person, I have a day job. And the ops people are like, oh, we thought it was just some application. And while that sounds like a nightmare that I'm making up, I see this a lot. And I was on another conference call, and somebody was asking me 30 questions, and I finally got to the point. I said, you know what you guys need to do in your company? You need to start talking to each other. Have meetings, talk, speak, communicate.
Stop that.
Like you said,
Stop
David,
that right now.
figure out where those lines are. Because sometimes there isn't a line, there's a big gray area that nobody's touching in between.
Actually, as a third-party vendor, I have found myself sitting at a table with people that have never met one another.
I know what you're
And you
gonna
become
say.
a referee. We're going a whole different path.
I've been there. I was. I did
you
that.
become
just
the
last week.
referee, and it's really, really awkward.
Yep, I had one this morning with a pretty large security conscious organization, and I had to pull the nicest way possible. I said, have you two not spoken before? Because you figure out who's doing what here. Yeah, somebody had flung something over the fence to deploy something in Kubernetes, and they had to go to, now everybody brace yourself, I'm going to say a cringy word, they had to go to a security and change approval board just to open up some ports to talk to something else, just to deploy an app that they thought that they could deploy a week ago. So, now they're backed up because nobody knew that the line had shifted or needed to be shifted, and they had a black hole from an operational standpoint in their Kubernetes cluster, because the developer said, I know exactly how to deploy this app. It's pretty easy. I get the images and I issue a couple, kubectl commands, and it's up and running, right? It's Kubernetes. But they didn't have permission to reach out beyond the cluster to get the images. That was locked off, and nobody even knew who to ask.
Yeah, I think that's an important topic. So I think traditionally I've worked, in the application performance management world, and a lot of production issues in terms of performance and availability happen because of differences between development, staging, and production. Mm-hmm. And when I look at the world of Kubernetes, I think what you just touched on is a really important nuance. It's important to have environments that are like for like,
yes,
that aren't being changed, that have some governance and controls over them. Because I can get the image that's available in my development environment. It's available in staging, but all of a sudden you deploy to production, and step one of that change that had to go through a whole change board, all of a sudden is failing. It's all approved. It's gone through that enterprise deployment mechanism, and it's now failing. And even if someone's using a much more advanced pipeline and say continuous deployment, this stance holds true. If development, staging, and production are not the same, people are immediately going to hit issues.
Well, and the sort of the good news is you're right. And one of the things about Kubernetes, its intention that people who are using it, is everything you talked about being able to bring up an environment that looks identical, your dev test and your prod look alike. That's really easy in Kubernetes. That's what it's for, generally speaking. The bad news is people I often see do it reverse. Like, well, we deployed Kubernetes, so now we're a modern environment. Like, no, it's a tool. You're going to get very mad at me if you bought a drill and we had a hard time cutting a tree down with it. Deploying Kubernetes doesn't make you a CI/CD shop or make you do DevOps properly. But those who do have the culture, and again, from an operations and a security standpoint, it will make things easier. But as an organization, you have to decide and know which one you want to be.
Correct. On a related networking topic, Platform 9 by default prefers to deploy Calico as the container networking interface.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned port and access to even get an image. That kind of sounds like something that was external to the cluster.
It was.
Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, that was their issue, that they had to run it through a very antiquated sort of cab. And the thing that I saw there was Kubernetes wasn't everything that Kubernetes brings you from an agility standpoint. This organization, because of the way that they operated, they really didn't get to take advantage of the speed of development of Kubernetes, because everything around it was so locked down and so slowed down that an application that was going to take a minute to deploy, getting the surrounding environment ready for that app was going to, and I'm not kidding, was going to take 2 weeks to maybe get approved.
Well,
just to
I think this is a good way to sort of dive into that analogy you use. Like, I've got a data center with some VMs running apps. Awesome. I've got a data center with a bunch of VMs running different Kubernetes clusters. It's like a data center within a data center.
It is a data center.
That external access is one element. Calico security policies can control which pods can talk to which pods. That's a good first step in controlling sort of, I guess, application layer security. That's something, if people haven't seen, I'm going to go to docs. If people are new or getting started or know Kubernetes but haven't really jumped into network policies, Calico and this getting started guide is really good. I love it because it gives you all of the steps and the commands to go through. If you go through this entire tutorial, you'll actually get a visualization again about 3 pods that can talk to each other, and you can start changing the Kubernetes policies and seeing the shift between how internally within the cluster those pods are able to either communicate or not communicate with each other. So this is a great starting spot for people that are in that learning journey. And I'm sure there's people that are on the line going, oh, but what about this thing called service mesh? Do both of these things add up to security? How can we do both of those things together? Our network team is really big on putting some of these policies into effect, and that's going to be our security stance. David or Johan, like, what's your view on this? Like, is Calico networking policies a good first step? Should someone just go to service mesh, or is there a misunderstanding about?
I think that there's a misunderstanding.
These two doing?
Even, and I'll use Istio because they're the predominant service mesh. Istio in their own documentation, right on their website, says, "Hi, Istio is not a security product. You can deploy Istio in a secure way, and there are secure best practices to employ there. And certainly some encryption across the wire is helpful, but service meshes are just that. They're service meshes. And you should use them. And if you've got a situation that's as complicated and you got a service you need to make available across, sometimes it's even multiple clusters, do use it. But I have seen people go, hey, we have Istio, now we have compliance. And I said, have you been through an audit yet? And they're like, no. I'm like, well, you don't. Of course, getting your network policies configured the right way is also very valuable, but there is a bit of a gap there when you've got like you said, a data center inside of a data center.
I think this topic of getting into container networking and then inevitably talking about service meshes, this is one of the core reasons that Kubernetes is so hard.
Yes, it is.
Because you have this relationship of ops to devs, and the goal is you want to give ops a reasonable way to manage the infrastructure and the platform without asking them to be a developer. And you want developers to be able to do the things that they do and create magical business functions and such, but not be an operator or not being locked down by operator things. And so you're trying to find the mix, right, between the two. And it's different for every single organization where that mix is. Service meshes are one of the tools that you can use to create that peace between the two. Because the operator can say, I'm going to software define the security policies. I'm not going to give you the ability to get on any port but 443. That's it. So I know that at least we're on, a safe place, and I'm only going to allow encrypted traffic and things like that. And I'm going to take a zero trust point of view when I configure my service mesh. And the developer is going to come back and say, that's cool, 443, I can work with that. I don't really need 80 or anything like that. I'm not going to make any weird things, or I can work with that. And it's a tool to create productive developers in a secure manner on a good platform, right? So you don't just instantly have security because you have a service mesh or container networking for that matter. In fact, you've complicated your world tremendously by doing that, but you have a lot of tools at your disposal to do good things with that.
I'm going to stop sharing for a second. We've got some content to step through on this particular topic.
Excellent. I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's see what I can make happen here. Excellent. Agreeing with what David was just saying, right? I'm assuming you see some green boxes, right? That data center in a data center is true, right? I've used that analogy before too, and I'm glad you brought it up. And it's a good news, bad news, right? It cuts both ways. Kubernetes obfuscates the way the network looks to an end user and developer. That's good news, right? Networking can be complicated. The bad news is that networking, isn't really quite visible inside of a Kubernetes cluster. Let's say, here's a picture of my little cluster I've got right here, right? I've got container to container traffic. Well, I can use a CNI like Calico or Flannel to declare policies at layer 3 and layer 4. You cannot see the traffic in a Kubernetes cluster. Right above that, I can't see the whole OSI model. I can declare policies, generally hope that they're true, and then use a little. Sometimes people can deploy eBPF to, check from a kernel process standpoint, did this happen or did it not happen? But I can't use a tried and true, especially when I'm talking to network people, a view of the network. I get a little bit of visibility north-south, but that's usually captured by some ingress and egress policies. And even then, that's hard to sort of pin DNS up against. Most of the time, I'm getting that with a external firewall that's checking to see what came out of this data center. There's lots of traffic going on inside of that I don't get to see, and so my traditional policies don't work. That's kind of where the company that I work for comes in, right? We've got a patented process. We're actually able to look at the entire OSI stack. We can go look at what the protocol is actually doing. We can see what those processes are actually doing. And to your example about using something like a service mesh, now you've got micro-segmentation across the network. Now I can say, oh, if I'm using a service mesh betwixt these containers because it needs a sidecar to do it, I can establish a policy that says, hey, these communication channels, let's say maybe it's PCI DSS compliant. I can go to my auditor and go, yes, we are establishing a policy that says this communication has to stay on the service mesh. If I see the same thing happening on the wire, but it's not using the encryption that the service mesh stood up, I can at a minimum alert on that, or I can even get in there and block that from happening at that true network layer. And it works really, actually quite well with service meshes like Istio. So it's not it isn't an either or. Those things are integrated because the service meshes are using a sidecar to communicate. That makes it pretty easy for us to get in there, look at what those workloads are, so I can see that traffic at that edge. We're able to do true packet capture.
Hey, Jordan.
Yep.
I'm sorry. I'm just going to take a moment here. We've been doing a lot of jaw jacking here, and I'm reading in the chat, and there's some opinion about our discussion has not quite gone the direction that they were expecting.
Oh, well, already then.
So I want to just take a moment to say to everyone, well, you don't have to stop, but I just want to say to everybody, like, this is an open forum. All right. If you have questions or you were, wanting for this to go a different direction or whatever, please chime in, say something. It's a safe place. We're talking about things, but we're here to, discuss what you're interested in.
Yeah,
not necessarily what we're interested in.
We want ask anything.
Yeah. So please chime in if maybe you had some questions or ideas or hopes about this session and they're not quite going that way. Please chime in and let us know. We'd be happy to either adapt or continue elsewhere or whatever. All right. Sorry, man. I didn't mean to.
No.
I know you're in your jam there, but
there are some questions that looks like have come. Constantine actually asked a couple of really good questions.
So maybe we'll cut off there for a minute.
Absolutely.
There's the SE Linux question. I've been looking at that. Also been waiting for future questions to come in. On SE Linux, this is something that we validate BearOS against, as well as the AWS and Azure native clusters, as we call them, because we build the masters and workers in those environments. So we validate on SE Linux enabled environments. We have not seen any issues in our tests or product from having an environment configured in such that way. SE Linux container policies. David, can you comment on that, or should we take this and reach out to Constantine?
Yeah, I'm not going near that right now.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good.
I don't want to misspeak on that.
Yeah, I would. I'm gonna take the same stance on getting into the container policies itself. Constantine, more than happy to reach out after this session, and we can get into the deeper details of that. I just see you raised your hand, so if you wanna jump in, we can.
But you know what though? Think about this for a minute, and I have to do this because this is kind of a learning moment. Because the funny thing is, the reason I don't want to, like, I work with Kubernetes every single day, and I've been doing it for some time. I've been writing applications for a very, very long time. And the reason I don't want to field that question is because I don't know it, right? I'm using this thing, and I've helped enterprises take applications to production in Kubernetes, which is a little scary. But then if you're going to ask me about, talk about container policies using Kubernetes on Linux, and I don't feel comfortable talking about it. And that's, I think that's a little bad on me, but I also kind of feel like that reflects back to, where we are. with things. And, there's always something to learn because this thing is just so hard.
I can echo
Kubernetes
those
is
sentiments.
it was a very Zen thing, right? The more you learn, the more you know you don't know.
Yeah.
I told somebody yesterday, if you're interviewing somebody to admin Kubernetes, and somewhere in the interview they say, you know what, I don't think I know anything about Kubernetes, hire them immediately.
That's where you got to start off with. First slide. I know nothing about Kubernetes. Let's talk about it.
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of why I was sort of working on a layered approach for this discussion. Like, we know a lot of people are getting started. If you are further into that journey, throw some questions out there. If you think what we're chatting about and touching on is important, we can continue talking. I think admission control is probably another topic worthy of diving into. I'm more than happy to spend some time to see how NuVector approaches this. I think security is something that people should take seriously and look at the market and understand, as David mentioned, what are we doing at the node level?
Right.
What are we doing in the operating system? What are we doing in the cluster? Do we want to operate tooling ourselves, or do we want to go to market and look at different solutions out there? Given the change in pod security policies, and there's Gatekeeper and Open Policy Agent is an option. For people that haven't looked at Open Policy Agent, it's a standard. It's kind of developed to work across multiple different resources, and the Kubernetes community is working on projects that can integrate Open Policy Agent into Kubernetes as just another cloud native design. But there's also companies out there like NuVector that have also taken a stance on this particular approach on securing a cluster. And I wouldn't mind sort of seeing what that looks like. I think it's also important to understand how that fits into development pipelines as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm sharing. This is a little matrix of what those PSPs are doing. What was the PSP control inside of our product, and how they can be put inside and it can be used. You could tell there was a spreadsheet we put together because people started asking, can we do this? As PSPs go away and I'm using them, how do I either not get conflicts, or how do I bring them back up? We have a lot of end users that are using PSPs and want to use them from a layered approach. So we were able to put those back inside, but we've been doing those PSPs for a long time. In fact,
Can you give us the elevator pitch on what is a PSP?
A pod security policy is really something that is a set of rules that must be followed before somebody can take a container and deploy, or take an image and deploy it as a container inside of an environment. That's the short version. I'll show you. Here's a good example, right? I'm using this. I could say, hey, containers cannot be run as root, or cannot be run as root inside of this particular namespace inside of a cluster, or has it been checked, or does it have a particular CVE in it, or even something more complicated, right? As you can see on my screen, I could have, and that's part of PSPs get rolled up into admission control, just like Chris was saying. I could say, maybe in my environment, I want a count of high severity CVEs, vulnerabilities that have a fix. I might say to my organization, thou shall have 0, right? You cannot deploy to this environment. Maybe it's part of a particular namespace. If you have a fixable CVE that's considered high sev. I could get more granular and say, all right, the fix came out, I'll give you 2 weeks to fix it, and then add that as a rule inside of the environment. So now I'm doing vulnerability management, not just at the code and the image build level, but I'm doing a vulnerability management step at the deployment level. So wow. That's right there at the front end.
Now you have your developers yelling at their managers, at the VP, saying, WTF, I can't push my stuff.
Well, that's true, right? And then we'll say, well, that's probably good news. Again, back to talking to people, right? I might deny this, or again, what happens in this instance is it'll give an alert back to the person deploying it saying, hey, you've got a high SEV. Here comes the alert. We're letting you through this time. But once this 2 weeks from the release of the fix has been by, we might deny you that build.
Right.
Andreas, yes. So PSPs again are being deprecated, but you can start to do PSPs right here in this interface.
And they're being deprecated for admission control.
That's that map right there. So yeah, yes, I love PSPs too. Like CNCF is taking them away from you, or you could not upgrade.
I think it's because of
cluster.
I think it's the complexity of managing them.
Mm-hmm.
One could say yes, they are as code, but I mean, the example I like to use is you've built a cluster, you've deployed Calico. By default, it wants privileged. You turn on pod security policies, it's not gonna run.
Yep. Right, and that's what PSPs will do for you, is either allow or disallow things as rules inside of your environment. And
So
again,
immediately,
we're taking PSPs and adding on the ability to do vulnerability scanning up against it. Because what's happening is I'm grabbing onto, say I've got a bunch of registries. Well, I don't have any in this particular cluster, but I can take my my registries and scan for those vulnerabilities, and then know what those vulnerabilities might be. Let's see if I need to log into this one again. We've been talking so long, we got logged out. There are my registries right there. So I'm looking at the details of each and every image, and I know whether it has a high 7 in it or not. This one does, right? Here's a 7. I know that, oh, this vulnerability came in at this layer. I know what code was used to implement it. And so if it is a fixable CVE, which you can see everything that I'm running in this image does have a fix, I could just decide to put a policy in place that either denies that build, or if I don't want to make my developers angry and we're not ready to move that far in the environment, I could certainly allow the deployment and send an alert off to a SIM, yell in a Slack channel, hey, Carl pushed an image that's got some high SEVs in it. Let's get on this from a security standpoint. Does that help?
yeah, I think that's this makes sense to me. I think security is definitely an advanced topic in terms of the world of Kubernetes.
It is.
The early adopters, the people who've been here in Kubernetes for say 3-4 years running in production, I think we're at the point where they're sort of saying, right, how do I handle security across our environments? How do I not impact velocity in development and work, keep it consistent, right? So
And
I'm
therein
not
lies
getting any
the
surprises when you get to production.
Right. So a lot of times agility overrides security, and the security department just feels like they're the department of no. So sometimes that's how Kubernetes clusters are born. Somebody built a Kubernetes cluster, followed all the rules to build the VMs, like in my earlier example, and are kind of sort of getting away with what they want because, hey, my app is running. See how fast we are? So I even got some.
I think.
Yep. Oh, I got an SSL.
I was going to say image scanning is a great thing as well.
Is.
And a great start. There's definitely lots of products out there. I know JFrog, who Platform 9 works with, also have the ability to do image scanning. If you're using Helm charts to deploy third-party apps, I'd definitely recommend understanding the potential of exposure by using a registry image scan. Or if you're working with other third-party tools that are built for Kubernetes and cloud native, ask. Right
right, and that's the challenge with just chasing vulnerabilities. Is vulnerability management has toil to it. It is a lot of work. It asks for a lot from an organization, and I think you were just touching on it too. I might, my developer might say, I can't patch these. I'm busy. I've got to get my code out, or I might have a vulnerability that there is no fix for it. Right, that we are aware of the CVE, there isn't a patch, but we need this library to run our app. Or the same thing, you wind up with a situation where it isn't known. That's the thing about CVEs is somebody has to find it, test it, report it. It has to get into the database. It has to be pulled from the database, brought into your environment, scanned. You have to talk to your developers and say, please patch this. In the meantime, business is going on. And that's why understanding the network, protecting the network at the front end, and having a layered approach to security. And again, doing image inspection at multiple points along the deployment lifecycle is not defense in depth. Sorry, defense in depth means taking different approaches to security.
And this is just a CVE in the app.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat now, I'm reading my nose down here. Andreas asks, how do you manage that running image being rescanned from time to time? That's actually a good question, right? And some of that's a little bit technological, and some of that is sort of operational. I can certainly go back and look at, say, I'll go pull up some security risks here. So Andreas, to your question, let's say we've been through all those checks. An application has been deployed, it passed everything. And as we know, code ages poorly. So suddenly a newly discovered CVE crops up on maybe a running image. Let me go find one that's really, really new. I've got one, this new curl one is, and I've got it actually running in a container. What you would not want to do, I wouldn't in any production environment, was go, whoops, new CVE and murder that container. No one would like you. I mean, if you work at a company where that's okay, please let me know, but I haven't met one yet, right? So now I've got a situation where I'm running, I've got an impact. I can see I actually have a running container with this CVE on it, or I've got, here's a fresh one. I've got one that's got some fixes. This is just an image I haven't deployed as a container yet inside of my environment. What we're going to do is report on it, hopefully get back to the developer to have them fix it. But what I've also done is I've wrapped some security around this. So in the group where this particular container is running, I've got all the way up through layer 7 security protocols wrapped around it, so that even if somebody wanted to exploit this particular CVE, they couldn't, because that service is not exposed that way to anybody who shouldn't be touching it. Or I could just deny having curl running on those containers. Right? I could just go, let me see if I got something here. I could go say, I don't want curl, I might have a process profile rule where, I don't have curl running on this container. I could just say, that's not a permitted rule. And if somebody tries to run curl on this and I've got it in a fully protected mode, somebody couldn't run curl or couldn't SSH into this if they weren't allowed to.
But I mean, obviously you can only do that. You can only do that before the application's run, right?
No, this is live.
Well, but I'm saying, like, you wouldn't, if an application was running and it was using curl, and then you went in and said, nobody else can do this.
Sure.
That there may be a few others that you need to consult.
Yeah, absolutely. Last thing I want to do is pull the plug out from it. And Andreas asked a very good question. Yes, you can set up an environment like this where if these rules were violated, we would still allow that to happen, but it would notify a SIM, like a syslog or Datadog, Splunk, PagerDuty. We could shout out there and let somebody know that, by the way, this vulnerability exists, or somebody is attempting to run a process on this container that wasn't part of the pre-approved permit list, and then do an alert. We can completely do that. This is really a zero trust environment that you've set up here without interfering with the operations of your application. For example, I'm just, I'm running the product right now. This container, for example, these orange lines mean, oh, these were not part of some rules that were allowed. I can get this alert in a SIM and go, ooh, what's this? I can go look at what happened there. Maybe I want to allow this and write a rule to permit it from now on. But I did not stop this from happening, but I did alert on it. Does that help?
If I could, I want to try to complete this picture a little bit, because what you're showing is very, very good and very cool controls. But I think the piece that we haven't looked at is how did this start from the beginning? And so you're right, almost on the line here, and everything that Jordan's talking about, you're almost on the line between that contract between the developer and the operator.
Yeah.
So this started with the developer saying, I need to create this application, or I did create this application. In order for this application to run, it needs, it's going to run an operating system of some Linux flavor. It needs, these main versions of a kernel or whatever. And I need, a runtime of Java, and I need these ports open because I'm going to do these things, or I need these packages installed on the operating system. The developer does all that by writing a container definition, right? You'll note as a Docker file. They do all that. And the thing is, developers doing all that work without ever consulting anyone else. They're just, and typically, they're just doing it because this is what needs to be done for my application to run. And they're going to get all that built and get it right. Hopefully, they were proactive about security and thought about things and not just opening up, 50 different ports on the container or something. But that's the way it's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And then they're going to build an image out of that. And then they're going to try to deploy that image to Kubernetes. And that is where you have the line of everything that's Jordan showing you, saying, well, you just push something up that's doing bad things, or, in our eyes is not very smart. Although you may have developed the application that way, we need to talk about this. So I'm either going to set up a policy that just blocks you right from the beginning that says you can't push a container up that's got curl in it. Or you say, I'm going to scan for you and I'm going to notify you that, hey, you need to stop doing this.
Or in this example, where that line may blur is, for example, I might deploy an app. I've organized, my application automatically is in groups, and I'm in what's called discover mode. And while that's happening, rules are getting written, right? I've looked and said, when this application is running, it needs all of these things to function. It needs to run these processes on the container. It needs these network rules so we know exactly what those processes are. And then I can take that group policy, export it out. Let me just put this here. And I could say, oh, I've created a policy and I can open up this configuration. Let me bring this up into my window so you can actually see. Come here, window. Come on, window. Try that again. It won't let me move to the next window. Here we go. Look at that. It's a YAML file. But what I've done is I've learned all of the network and process activities that have happened for this application. I can hand this YAML file to my developer and go, look, we wrote the security for you. You don't have to go write this. Is this the way your application is supposed to behave? And the developer can say, why, yes, it is. Thank you. And then once I'm done learning all those processes, I can, and this is back to Andreas's question, I can put this into what's called a discover mode. So now I'm no longer learning what's happening inside of this environment, but I'm monitoring for anything that is anomalous to the behavior of that application. So then I can get alerted on it. And now I've really got a zero trust network going on inside of my Kubernetes cluster. And I brought back that kind of stuff that our network and firewall people love so much without slowing down development.
So he asked another good question here.
I think I got to it. That's typically how we do it, Andreas, is where you, a lot of times we're either, I was talking to somebody yesterday where they had the developers going, is this the way your application is supposed to behave? Right? Are these the processes that should be there? I mean, look at this, somebody bashed into this. Is bin bash a part of your application? I say, no, why are people shelling into containers? Bad sysadmin. So I'm going to go in here and go, well, let's just get rid of that, right? So here, now notice what I just did. I got rid of the permit rule to run bash inside of these containers. If somebody tries to bash into a container in this group, we'll let them, but we'll alert you. If I took this group and put it into full-on protect mode and somebody tried to bash into this container, it just won't happen.
You're getting a phone call.
Yeah.
So you can decide how you want to do it. I mean, if I'm running an organization and we're really using containers the way we're supposed to, I don't want people shelling into containers to fix things, because that's a very bad practice internally. Like, the person shelling into this container wasn't some hacker, it's somebody that works for my company. Like, oh, whoops, let me fix that. Like, hey, we're not running VMs here. Another container is going to come up. Go fix the problem, run it through the pipeline, redeploy. And I go, okay, boss, sorry.
It could be a legitimate thing. Like, look, the application I put in here, it's writing its logs to local disk, and I'm trying to get in to read the logs. That's why I'm using bash.
Absolutely. And in that case, we do want to, let's say we're, pretend this is our organization and this was production. Let's say we've not allowed that. And you can say, oh my God, I've got a problem. Let's go into break glass mode. All right, well, let's just turn it back to monitor, allow that to happen, log all those activities, or just completely log them all the time inside of your organization and go, yeah, I know who is shelling into my container. That's okay. But knowing is very valuable.
Yeah.
And getting that information back out so you can say to your organization, we know what's actually happening, quote unquote, on the wire inside of our Kubernetes cluster. It's no longer the mysterious, a data center to a data center, the universe is on Orion's belt.
Andreas is making a good point here. Yes, Andreas, developers are very, very sensitive.
Absolutely. Amen, my brother. I agree with you, Andreas. That's why we don't turn these rules. We're not, if you look in my environment, I've got nothing in that group, right? Let's go back to that application. My demo application, so cleverly named. Nothing is in deny mode. I have these rules, but they're not being enforced. They're being monitored against. And I might say, hey, I've got some very sensitive information. Only these things can talk to each other. I may have a backend database. I know for a fact that members out of this group are the only things that should be talking to the backend database over these ports, full stop. I will wrap a nice candy shell of security around that communication because I know nothing else should be happening. But you're right. We do not want to slow down development and operations of applications.
I just looked at the time. Chris, you were trying to get...
I was going to say, it is, we are over time. Sometimes we all have hard stops right now. I personally do not. I think it's interesting that we're looking at this. I've built the application. I'm now running the application. When we started the conversation, we're talking about OS nodes cluster. Right. I think one of the other important factors to talk about here is, well, what happens when Kubernetes announces to the world there's a vulnerability? Or what happens when your container runtime announces to the world that there's a vulnerability? So all of a sudden you've got a cluster itself that's not compliant. It's not the applications, you've done all the things there. It's not your network, you've done all the things there. It's, hey, as happens in the world of software, you don't know until you know.
Look at all the vulnerabilities on my nodes here. And this is garden variety GKE that's generally up to date. And some of these have fixes and some of them don't. You have to ask your organization, what are you going to do about that? And it's not a cut and dry answer for every company.
I can say from a platform 9 perspective, we sit on the security SIG, we get notifications.
Yep.
And we immediately task our engineering team to building a new build.
And that's why people should be using platform 9 to let you guys take care of that, because people have day jobs and this is scary stuff right here.
Yeah, and we'll send out a notification and we'll, in our SaaS management plan, people will see, hey, there's an upgrade available for your cluster, and we'll patch all of the master nodes, and then we'll go through the worker nodes, ensure that your applications don't go offline through the requested upgrade strategy, and implement patches for all of the pieces of software that are in that value chain of Kubernetes, because it's not just Kubernetes.
Yep.
All right, guys, you want to wrap up?